That's a $5,000 special assessment, Mr. Caldwell. Payable within 30 days. And if you think your precious oak tree is more important than my brand new driveway, you're about to learn a very expensive lesson about property lines and consequences. The words dripping with a syrupy, self-satisfied venom hung in the humid afternoon air. Karen, the newly crowned empress of our suburban homeowners association, stood on her gleaming, pristine white concrete driveway, a testament to modern construction that clashed violently with the quiet, established character of the neighborhood. She was a woman built like a filing cabinet, solid and overflowing with what she believed were important documents. Her plus-size frame squeezed into a floral pantsuit that screamed, assertive garden party. In her hand she held a clipboard, her ultimate symbol of power, which she brandished not like an organizational tool, but like a weapon of minor bureaucratic warfare. She tapped a perfectly manicured, blood-red fingernail on a line item. Her gaze shifted from the clipboard to me, then to the hairline crack in her concrete, a spiderweb fissure no longer than my hand, located perilously close to the invisible line that separated her kingdom from my sanctuary. Behind me, casting a long, benevolent shadow that reached almost to her feet, stood the real target of her ire, the magnificent, century-old pin oak my grandfather had planted the day he returned from his service overseas. It was more than a tree, it was a living monument, a silent patriarch of our family's little patch of earth. Karen saw a nuisance, a root-spreading menace. I saw a legacy. The sheer audacity of her demand, a $5,000 penalty for a crack that was likely the result of a cheap contractor and hasty curing, sent a hot flash of anger through me. But years in the Army Corps of Engineers, planning and executing complex projects under immense pressure, had taught me to compartmentalize rage. Emotion was a liability. Data was an asset. I held her gaze, my face a mask of deliberate calm, which only seemed to infuriate her more. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to yell, to argue, to give her the ammunition she needed to paint me as an uncooperative, belligerent resident. I would not give her the satisfaction. Before I tell you how this woman tried to bankrupt me, defame me, and ultimately weaponize our entire community against me over a slab of poorly poured concrete, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends because the lesson she ended up teaching was not the one she intended. After our little standoff, Karen pivoted on her sensible heels and marched back to her house, the clipboard held triumphantly aloft. I remained by the oak, running my hand over its rough, familiar bark. My grandfather, Sergeant Thomas Caldwell, had brought the sapling back from a trip to Virginia, cradling it in a burlap sack for the entire train ride home. He'd planted it right there, on the edge of the property he'd bought with his military pay, a symbol of putting down roots after years of displacement. The tree had witnessed my father's childhood, my own, and now my daughter's. It was woven into the fabric of our lives, its branches holding memories of tire swings and first kisses, its shade providing a cool respite on countless summer days. Moving into this house, my family home, was supposed to be a peaceful transition into civilian life after 2 decades of service. My wife, Sarah, and I wanted stability for our daughter, Emily. We wanted a community. What we got was Karen. She had moved in about 5 years prior, and through a combination of relentless campaigning and the general apathy of most residents, had seized control of the 3-person HOA board. Her reign began subtly, with sternly worded newsletters about recycling, bin placement, and lawn length. But power for a person like Karen is not a tool. It's a hunger. Soon came the fines, the public shamings at board meetings, the creation of labyrinthine new rules governing everything from mailbox color to the type of flowers one could plant. She was building her own little fiefdom, and her brand new, ostentatiously large driveway was to be its crown jewel. I had watched the contractors for a week. They were a sloppy, loud crew who left cigarette butts in my azaleas and splattered concrete slurry on my lawn, which I had quietly cleaned up myself to avoid conflict. I remember thinking their prep work seemed rushed, but it wasn't my project to manage. I never imagined their carelessness would become my $5,000 problem, or that Karen's entitlement was so vast it could physically extend onto my property. Standing there in the cool shade of my grandfather's oak, I made a silent promise. This wasn't just about a crack in the concrete anymore. This was about the tree. It was about my home. It was about a bully who had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. Karen wanted a war over property lines and consequences. As a retired engineer who'd spent a career drawing lines and calculating consequences, I decided I was uniquely qualified to give her one. The official notice arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail as if it were a state secret. It was a masterpiece of intimidating pseudo-legalese, printed on the HOA's freshly designed, very expensive letterhead, complete with a new motto, "Preserving Perfection Together." The letter, signed by Karen as president, cited 3 separate bylaws, each highlighted in a different color, concerning resident-caused property damage, vegetation encroachment, and failure to maintain property boundaries. It formally levied the $5,000 special assessment against my property and gave me a 15-day window to either pay the fine or submit a professional remediation plan for the removal of the offending root system, which would, of course, kill the tree. The alternative, it stated in bold, italicized, and underlined letters, was legal action, the full cost of which will be borne by the homeowner. I read it twice, a cold, methodical anger replacing the initial heat of the confrontation. This wasn't a neighborly dispute. This was a declaration of war, meticulously crafted to overwhelm and intimidate. Sarah watched me from the kitchen doorway, her brow furrowed with worry. $5,000 for that tiny crack? Can she do that? She asked, her voice tight with anxiety. I folded the letter and placed it on the table. She thinks she can, I said, but she's made a critical error. She's documented her attack. My training kicked in, overriding the stress. In the military, when faced with a complex problem, you don't charge in blindly. You gather intelligence, you analyze the terrain, you identify the adversary's weaknesses, and you formulate a precise, multi-phase plan of attack. Karen was my adversary. The HOA bylaws were her weapon. My terrain was my own property. My first phase was intelligence gathering. I retrieved my high-resolution DSLR camera, the one I used for landscape photography, and began my own documentation. I didn't just take a picture of the crack. I took dozens of photos from every conceivable angle, with a ruler placed next to it for scale. I photographed the property survey marker, a small iron pin nearly hidden by the grass, which I knew was located just inches from the edge of her new concrete. I took wide shots showing the vast expanse of her driveway and the laughably small fissure she was using as a pretext. I photographed the base of my oak, its powerful, gnarled roots spreading like thick veins into the earth, and I documented the exact point where her concrete slab met my lawn. It was then that I noticed it, a subtle but definite lip. Her driveway wasn't just next to my property. It felt like it was on it. The grass was crushed and discolored right at the edge, as if the forms for the pour had been laid directly on top of it. This was my first piece of actionable intelligence. My second came from the cloud. I had a home security system with cameras covering the front and sides of my house. I paid for the extended storage plan, a feature I'd never really needed until now. I spent the next 2 hours scrolling through footage from the week Karen's driveway was installed. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, watching a time-lapse of cars driving by and squirrels bearing nuts. And then I found it. At 7:32 a.m. on a Tuesday, the contractor's crew began setting up the wooden forms for the main slab. The camera angle from the side of my garage was perfect. I could clearly see 2 workers hammering stakes into the ground. I zoomed in, enhancing the image as much as the software would allow. There it was, clear as day. The wooden form board extended well past the invisible property line, sitting directly on top of the patch of lawn I had just photographed. They had built their mold on my land, pouring their concrete over the surface roots of my oak tree. A slow, grim smile spread across my face. This was more than a smoking gun. It was a signed confession. But I knew Karen. She would dismiss the video as misleading or doctored. She would argue the angle was deceptive. I needed something she couldn't dispute, something official and legally binding. I put the video file on a secure thumb drive and opened a new browser window. My search terms were certified arborist root system analysis and licensed land surveyor property dispute. I wasn't just going to defend myself against her ridiculous claim. I was going to build a fortress of facts so impenetrable that her attack would shatter against it. I spent the rest of the evening vetting professionals, reading reviews, and checking credentials. I found a surveyor, Frank Peterson, a gruff-looking ex-Marine whose website testimonials all said the same thing. He finds the line, and the line is the line. Perfect. Then I found him. Dr. Alistair Finch, a PhD in arboriculture with a long list of publications on urban forestry and root structure integrity. His website had a whole section on litigation support. He was expensive, but I knew he would be worth every penny. This was no longer about a $5,000 fine. This was about principle. Karen had used a formal document to threaten my property and my family's legacy. I was going to use formal documented evidence to dismantle her entire reality. The battle of paperwork had begun, and I was determined to win it. Frank Peterson, the surveyor, arrived 2 days later, his truck a rugged Ford F2, 5.0 with a Marine Corps emblem on the back window. He was exactly as his website promised, a man of few words and immense professional gravity. He moved with an economy of motion, setting up his transit and laser measurement tools with the practiced ease of a sniper assembling his rifle. He didn't engage in small talk. He just nodded when I showed him the original plat map from when the house was built and got to work. For 2 hours, he took readings, consulted his GPS locator, and drove small, temporary wooden stakes into the ground. Karen must have been watching from her window because as Frank began to pack up, she emerged from her front door, arms crossed, a thunderous look on her face. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, marching toward us, her voice carrying across the lawn. Frank ignored her, handing me a small printout from his portable device. He pointed to a new bright pink flag he had just hammered into the ground. The flag was a full 2 feet inside her pristine, white driveway. "That's your line," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The original survey pin is right here." He tapped a spot on the grass with his boot. "And that line runs straight as God's own arrow. Her slab is on your property by 28 inches at this point, tapering to about 22 inches down by the curb." Karen's face went from pink to a deep mottled crimson. "That's impossible. That's absurd. I had this professionally installed. Your little flag is wrong." Frank slowly turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, I've been a licensed surveyor in this state for 30 years. My equipment is calibrated annually and is legally certified. The line is the line. Your concrete is on his property. It's a simple matter of trespass and encroachment." He then looked back at me, gave a curt nod, and said, "Full report and certified plat map will be in your email by 5 o'clock. And with that, he was gone, leaving Karen sputtering in the wake of his indisputable facts. The sight of that pink flag, standing like a defiant soldier on her sea of white concrete, was one of the most satisfying things I had ever seen. The next phase of my counteroffensive began the following week with the arrival of Dr. Alistair Finch, the arborist. Where Frank was all grim precision, Dr. Finch was a flurry of academic enthusiasm. He was a tall, wiry man with a shock of white hair and eyes that lit up when he saw the oak tree. "Oh, she's a magnificent specimen, a Quercus palustris, and a very healthy one at least for now." He spent the first hour just observing, walking around the tree, examining its bark, its canopy, its lean. Then he got out his equipment, which was far more exotic than the surveyor's. He had a device that looked like a small lawnmower, which he explained was ground-penetrating radar. "This will let us map the major root structures without disturbing the soil," he said, his excitement palpable. He spent an hour rolling the machine in a careful grid pattern across my lawn and, with my explicit permission, over the 28-inch section of Karen's driveway that was on my property. The screen on his device bloomed with a complex network of lines and shadows. "Just as I suspected," he murmured. "The primary flare and several major structural roots are directly under this slab." Next, he brought out a tool called an air spade. It was connected to a large compressor on his truck and looked like a futuristic pressure washer. "We'll use compressed air to gently excavate the soil around the root collar. It removes the dirt without harming the delicate root tissues. I want to see exactly what her contractors did. For the next hour, he carefully blew away the soil at the base of the tree where it met the concrete. What he uncovered was damning. The clean, professional job I had imagined was a butcher's hackery. Thick, woody roots, some as wide as my forearm, were scraped and scarred. Dozens of smaller, fibrous feeder roots had been severed completely, their ends raw and exposed. "This is appalling, Doctor," Finch said, shaking his head in disgust. "They didn't just pour over the roots. They used shovels or a mini excavator to dig down, creating a level bed for their gravel base. They scalped the root system, and by pouring non-porous concrete directly over it, they've cut off water and oxygen to this entire section. They've essentially suffocated and starved a major part of the tree's support system." He pointed to the hairline crack in Karen's driveway. "This crack, it's not the tree's fault, it's gravity's. They poured a massive, heavy slab of concrete on top of improperly compacted, disturbed soil and a living root system. The ground settled a fraction of an inch, and the cheap, low-tensile strength concrete they used cracked under its own weight. Your tree didn't damage her driveway, Mr. Caldwell. Her driveway is actively killing your tree." He took dozens of photographs documenting every scrape, every severed root, every inch of the suffocated soil. His final report, which arrived 2 days later, was a 20-page work of art. It included the radar maps, the annotated photographs, and a concluding statement that was unequivocal. The damage to the driveway was a direct result of grossly negligent construction practices, and the construction itself had caused significant and potentially irreversible harm to a heritage oak, constituting clear property damage against me. The cost of remedial care to try and save the tree, he estimated, would be in the thousands. I now had 2 legally certified expert reports, video evidence, and a clear case of property encroachment and damage. Karen had thrown a rock. I was about to drop a mountain on her. Armed with a folder thick with evidence, Frank's certified survey, Dr. Finch's exhaustive Arborist report, and a thumb drive containing the security footage, I felt the tactical advantage shift decisively in my favor. My next move had to be precise. I didn't want to go straight to lawyers. That was an escalation I wanted to hold in reserve. My strategy was to give Karen and the board a formal, documented opportunity to retreat. If they refused, their decision would be recorded, adding another layer to my case. I sent a polite, formal email to the HOA's generic address, requesting a special meeting with the board to present new information regarding assessment number 74B. I gave no hint as to the nature of the information. They scheduled it for the following Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and bureaucratic apathy. I arrived exactly on time. Karen was seated at the head of a long folding table, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, Barry and Janice. Barry was a retired insurance salesman who seemed to be perpetually confused, nodding along to whatever Karen said. Janice was a stern, thin-lipped woman who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from enforcing rules. They both wore the smug, self-assured expressions of people who believed they held all the cards. "Mr. Caldwell," Karen began, her tone dripping with condescension, "we're all very busy. I hope you're here to inform us that you've made arrangements to pay the assessment." I calmly took my seat opposite them and opened my folder. "Actually, I'm here to demonstrate why that assessment is not only invalid, but fraudulent, and to formally request that it be rescinded." I started by sliding 3 copies of the surveyor's report across the table. "This is a certified survey of my property line, conducted last week by a licensed professional. As you can see, your new driveway, Ms. Peterson," I made a point of using her last name to maintain a formal distance, "was poured on my property, encroaching by as much as 28 inches. I then turned my laptop around and played the security footage, a clear, undeniable view of her contractors hammering stakes into my lawn. Barry squinted at the screen, his confusion deepening. Janice's thin lips tightened into a single bloodless line. Karen, however, was unfazed, or at least she pretended to be. She waved a dismissive hand. "A few inches? We're talking about a few inches of grass. The fact remains that your tree's roots cracked my $5,000 driveway. That is the issue here." "I'm glad you brought that up," I said, my voice even. I then distributed the copies of Dr. Finch's 20-page Arborist report. This is a report from Dr. Alistair Finch, a leading expert in arboriculture. I draw your attention to page 17, the conclusion. I let them read it, the silence in the room growing heavy. I watched Karen's eyes scan the damning words. Grossly negligent construction practices, improperly compacted soil, suffocated and starved the root system. The crack is a direct result of contractor error. Her face, which had been a mask of smug authority, began to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving a pasty, mottled complexion. This is nonsense, she sputtered, throwing the report onto the table. This is fabricated. You paid this doctor to write whatever you wanted. I remained calm. Dr. Finch is a respected, court-certified expert. His findings are based on ground-penetrating radar and physical evidence. The same evidence I will be happy to present in a court of law, should it come to that. I leaned forward slightly, my tone shifting from informational to demanding. So here is what is going to happen. First, the $5,000 assessment against me will be immediately and formally rescinded, with a written confirmation sent to me within 48 hours. Second, the HOA will issue a formal, written apology for the baseless accusation. And third, Ms. Peterson, you will personally bear the full cost of having the encroaching section of your driveway professionally removed from my property. And you will also pay for the remedial tree care outlined by Dr. Finch in his report, an estimated cost of $3,200. The room was utterly silent for a moment. Barry looked at Karen, waiting for his cue. Janice seemed to be calculating the political fallout. Karen stared at me, her eyes blazing with a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated hatred. The idea that she, the president, was being told what to do, that she was being held accountable, was more than she could process. She exploded. "Absolutely not," she shrieked, slamming her hand on the table, rattling the coffee cups. "This is extortion. You are harassing me. I will not be intimidated." She stood up, her face contorted with rage. "The assessment stands. And you know what? I'm not waiting for the HOA. I am personally suing you, Mr. Caldwell, for the full $10,000 replacement cost of my driveway and for personal harassment. And I will make sure the HOA pays for my legal fees to defend its president against a rogue resident." She was pointing a trembling finger at me, her voice echoing in the small room. Barry and Janice just stared, their smugness replaced by alarm. It was a complete meltdown, a total loss of control. And in that moment, she had escalated the conflict far beyond a simple dispute. She had declared her intention to use community funds for a personal vendetta. I calmly gathered my papers, stood up, and looked her directly in the eye. "Thank you for clarifying your position, Ms. Peterson. Your statements have been duly noted." I walked out of the room, leaving her fuming in the wreckage of her own making. The war of documents was over. The legal war was about to begin. The lawsuit summons arrived a week later, just as Karen had promised. It was a thick, intimidating packet of documents, accusing me of everything from property damage to intentional infliction of emotional distress. She wasn't just suing for the cost of the driveway, she had inflated the number to an even $10,000, tacking on nebulous claims for damages and legal consultation. The plaintiff was listed as Karen Peterson and the Northwood Estates Homeowners Association. She had officially weaponized the entire community against me, using our collective dues to fund her personal crusade. Sarah read the papers with a growing sense of dread. "This is insane, Mark. She's actually doing it. What are we going to do? Hiring a lawyer is going to cost a fortune." I put my arm around her. "It is insane," I agreed, "and that's why she's going to lose. Bullies like her count on their victims being too scared or too broke to fight back. We're not going to be either." I knew we needed professional help, but not just any lawyer. We needed someone who understood the peculiar viciousness of HOA politics. Someone who saw a case like this not as a burden, but as an opportunity. I put a call out to my old network from the Corps of Engineers, a group of men and women who knew a thing or two about fighting entrenched bureaucracies. The recommendation came back in less than an hour from a buddy of mine in Texas. "My sister Jessica Martinez," he said. "She's a property lawyer in your state. She eats rabid HOA boards for breakfast. The description was promising. I called her office the next morning. When I explained the situation, her receptionist put me through to her directly. I spent 20 minutes laying out the timeline, the evidence, the meeting, and Karen's threats. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then I heard a low chuckle. "Mr. Caldwell," Jessica Martinez said, her voice sharp and energetic, "I think I'm going to like this case. Can you be in my office tomorrow with that folder of yours?" I met Jessica the next day. She was a force of nature, a petite, impeccably dressed woman with a mind like a steel trap and a smile that could be either charming or predatory depending on the situation. I laid out my evidence on her conference table. The survey, the Arborist's report, the video, my meticulous notes from the board meeting. She examined each document with an intense focus, her eyes lighting up as she connected the pieces. When she finished Dr. Finch's report, she looked up at me and grinned. "Oh, she has no idea what she's walked into," Jessica said, tapping the report. "This is a gift. Her entire case is predicated on your tree damaging her driveway, and you have an expert witness who will testify under oath that her contractor's negligence is the sole cause. This isn't just a good defense, Mr. Caldwell. This is a perfect defense." She leaned back in her chair. "We're not just going to defend against her ridiculous lawsuit. We're going to countersue, and we're going to hit her from every possible angle." Over the next hour, she mapped out the strategy. We would file a countersuit against Karen Peterson, personally for trespass, for building on my land, property damage, for harming the oak tree, and abuse of process, for using the legal system to harass and intimidate me. But the masterstroke was the second part of the plan. "We're also going to sue the Northwood Estates HOA," Jessica explained, "for breach of fiduciary duty. An HOA board has a legal responsibility to act in the best interest of the entire community, not to spend community funds on the president's personal vendetta against a neighbor. By funding her lawsuit, they violated that duty." While Jessica drafted the legal filings, I initiated another part of the plan: community intelligence. I knew I couldn't be the only one who had been targeted by Karen's reign of terror. I started by talking to my immediate neighbors. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Mr. Henderson, a quiet widower in his 70s who lived across the street, told me how Karen had fined him $50 a day for 3 weeks because his bird bath was made of non-compliant ceramic instead of the newly mandated natural stone. A young family 2 doors down, the Garcias, had been forced to spend thousands to repaint their entire house because Karen had used a paint swatch to declare their beige was too yellow compared to the approved color palette. Story after story emerged, a clear and undeniable pattern of abuse, overreach, and financial extortion. We formed a small, clandestine group, meeting in my living room after dark. We called ourselves the Northwood Community Alliance. We weren't a mob. We were an intelligence-sharing network. Everyone brought their documents, fine notices, threatening letters, photographs. We were building a dossier, a comprehensive record of Karen's abuses that would prove our countersuit's claim. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of behavior, and the board had knowingly enabled it. The legal papers from Jessica were filed the following week. The war had officially become a multi-front conflict. Karen had intended to isolate me. Instead, she had ignited a rebellion. The legal phase known as discovery is where many battles are won or lost before ever seeing a courtroom. It's a methodical, often tedious process where each side formally requests evidence from the other. For Karen, it was about to become a nightmare. Jessica Martinez drafted a discovery request that was a work of art in its brutal comprehensiveness. We didn't just ask for documents related to my case. We requested every email, text message, meeting minute, financial statement, and piece of correspondence sent or received by any HOA board member for the past 2 years concerning any and all rule enforcement actions. Karen's lawyer, a slick but ultimately second-rate attorney from a suburban strip mall, initially responded with a dismissive letter claiming the request was overly broad and burdensome. Jessica's response was to file a motion to compel with the court, arguing that the documents were essential to proving our claim of a pattern of abuse and breach of fiduciary duty. The judge, an experienced jurist who had likely seen his share of HOA shenanigans, agreed with us. He signed the order, compelling the HOA to turn over everything. The trickle of documents soon became a flood. Boxes of files and gigabytes of data were delivered to Jessica's office. We spent a week sifting through the mountain of paper and digital files, and what we found was more damning than I could have imagined. We found the email chains where Karen bullied Barry and Janice into approving her fines against other residents. We found financial records showing she had used the HOA debit card for personal expenses, which she later reimbursed with notes like accidental purchase. But the real gold was in the communications regarding her driveway contractor. The HOA bylaws, which Karen so loved to quote, clearly stipulated that any expenditure over $1,000 required 3 competitive bids. We found only one invoice, from the contractor who did the work. Then we found the email sent from Karen's personal account to the contractor a week before the job started. Jessica had subpoenaed the contractor's records as well, and they had complied, eager to distance themselves from a potential lawsuit. The email read, "Just get it done quickly. I want a clean, sharp edge along the property line. I don't care about the neighbor's scrubby lawn. Pour it right to the tree trunk if you have to for a clean edge. I'll handle any complaints." I read the email 3 times. It was a direct instruction to trespass and a clear admission that she knew her actions would be contentious. This was the kill shot. The next step was Karen's deposition, a formal videotaped interview where Jessica would question her under oath. It took place in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm. Karen arrived with her lawyer, looking confident and defiant, dressed in a power red blazer. She was ready for a fight. Jessica, however, was calm, almost serene. She began with simple, easy questions, lulling Karen into a sense of security. Then she began to lay the traps. She walked Karen through my evidence piece by piece. "Ms. Peterson, you claim my client's tree damaged your driveway. Is that correct?" "Yes, absolutely," Karen said firmly. "And you deny that your contractor built the driveway on his property?" "Of course I deny it. That survey is flawed." "And you deny that your contractor's shoddy work was the cause of the crack?" "It's a ridiculous accusation." Jessica paused, letting the silence hang in the air. She then slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a printout of the email she had sent to the contractor. "Ms. Peterson, can you please read the highlighted portion of this email aloud for the record?" Karen picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the sentence. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. Her lawyer, who clearly had not been shown this email by his client, leaned over to read it. His shoulders slumped, a look of profound defeat washing over him. "Ms. Peterson?" Jessica prompted gently. "For the record." Karen's hand was trembling. She stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing silently. She was caught. It was her email address. The date and time matched. The context was undeniable. She had lied just minutes before, under oath, about her instructions to the contractor. I don't recall sending this," she finally stammered, her voice a weak whisper. "You don't recall instructing your contractor to pour concrete right to the tree trunk on your neighbor's property?" Jessica pressed, her voice still calm but now edged with steel. "You are under oath, Ms. Peterson. Perjury is a serious offense." Karen looked at her lawyer, her eyes pleading for help, but he just stared down at the table, doodling on his legal pad. He had nothing. She had lied to him, and now she had lied under oath. The deposition was a complete and utter catastrophe for her. Her credibility was destroyed. Her case was in ruins. The confident, domineering HOA president had been reduced to a stammering, cornered liar on videotape, a recording that we could now present to a judge and jury. The trap had been sprung, and she had walked right into it. With Karen's disastrous deposition in hand, Jessica was confident we could file for a summary judgment and win the case outright, but she proposed a more strategic and ultimately more satisfying alternative. "A court victory is great," she explained, leaning back in her chair, "but it's private. The real power here is public accountability. Karen's authority comes from the perception of control within the community. We need to strip that away from her, in front of everyone." The perfect venue was approaching, the HOA's annual general meeting. It was the one time all year that residents gathered, and board elections were on the agenda. For the past 4 years, Karen had run for president unopposed. This year was going to be different. The Northwood Community Alliance shifted from intelligence gathering to mobilization. We didn't want to come across as an angry mob with pitchforks. Our weapon was information, delivered calmly and professionally. We spent a weekend drafting a simple one-page flyer. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Is this how your HOA dues are being spent?" Below, we laid out the facts in simple, bullet-pointed form. A diagram from the certified survey showing Karen's driveway encroaching on my property. A direct quote from Dr. Finch's report stating the damage was caused by contractor negligence. A pie chart showing that over $15,000 in HOA funds had been spent on legal fees for President Peterson's personal driveway dispute. And finally, the most damning piece of evidence, the quote from her email to the contractor. "I don't care about the neighbor's scrubby lawn. Pour it right to the tree trunk if you have to." At the bottom, we didn't call for her resignation. We simply wrote, "The annual general meeting is on Tuesday at 7 p.m. Attend, ask questions, demand transparency, your community, your money." Our second move was to find a candidate to run against her. The choice was obvious, Mr. Henderson. He was respected, level-headed, and had his own grievance with Karen's tyranny over the non-compliant birdbath. When we approached him, he was hesitant. "I'm retired," he said. "I don't want the drama." But as we showed him the stack of letters and fine notices from other neighbors, his hesitation turned to a quiet resolve. "Someone has to stop her," he said, finally agreeing to put his name on the ballot. In the days leading up to the meeting, we went door to door, not to campaign aggressively, but to hand out our flyer and talk to our neighbors. We simply presented the facts and encouraged them to attend. The response was electric. People who had felt isolated in their own battles with Karen were shocked to see the pattern laid bare. The $15,000 legal bill was a particular point of outrage. The night of the annual meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. In previous years, maybe 15 people would show up. Tonight, there were over 100. The room was buzzing with a tense, expectant energy. Karen walked in with Barry and Janice, her usual regal air firmly in place. She was clearly expecting another sparsely attended coronation. When she saw the crowd, a flicker of confusion, then alarm, crossed her face. She scanned the room, seeing dozens of faces she hadn't seen at a meeting in years. She saw me, sitting calmly in the back with Sarah. She saw Mr. Henderson sitting in the front row, looking serene and determined. For the first time since this ordeal began, Karen looked uncertain. Her fortress of apathy, the foundation of her power, had crumbled. The community she thought she controlled had finally woken up, and they had come with questions. The air was thick with a sense of impending reckoning. The showdown was about to begin, and she was no longer in control of the narrative. The meeting began with Karen attempting to project an aura of complete control, following the standard agenda with a rigid formality. She delivered her President's Annual Report, a self-congratulatory monologue filled with praise for the board's unwavering commitment to aesthetic excellence and property values. When she got to the budget section, she glossed over the enormous legal expenditure with a single, dismissive phrase, "And of course, necessary funds allocated to resolve a minor legal matter with a problematic resident intent on disrupting community harmony." From the back of the room, I could feel a wave of collective indignation ripple through the crowd. She was painting me as the villain, even now. When she finally, reluctantly, opened the floor for questions from the residents, a dozen hands shot into the air simultaneously. She pointed to a woman in the front, someone she likely thought was a friendly face. She was wrong. It was Mrs. Garcia, the mother whose house was deemed too yellow. "Karen," she began, her voice trembling but clear, "you said minor legal matter. The flyer we all received says the HOA has spent over $15,000 on this minor matter. Can you explain to us why our dues are being used to pay for a lawsuit about your personal driveway?" The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Karen was visibly taken aback. "That flyer is misleading propaganda," she snapped. "This is an official HOA action to protect our bylaws." Before she could continue, another hand went up. It was a young man I didn't even know. "The flyer also has a quote from an email you sent to your contractor, telling them to pour concrete on your neighbor's property. Did you send that email?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Karen's face went pale. I, that is taken out of context. It's part of an ongoing legal, but her voice was drowned out by another question, and then another. Why did you only get one bid for your driveway? Why was my mother fined for her wind chimes? What gives you the right to tell us what color to paint our homes? The questions came like a volley of arrows, piercing her armor of authority. Her attempts to gavel the room to silence were futile. She had lost the crowd completely. Then Mr. Henderson stood up. The room quieted, a wave of respect washing over the chaos. He didn't address Karen. He addressed the community. My friends, my neighbors, he began, his voice calm and steady. For too long, our HOA has been run on a platform of intimidation and punishment. A community isn't about the color of a house or the material of a bird bath. It's about people. It's about looking out for one another. We need a board that serves the residents, not one that polices them. We need transparency. We need common sense. We need to stop spending our money on lawsuits and start spending it on things that bring us together, like fixing the playground or hosting a community barbecue. His speech was simple, heartfelt, and powerful. It was everything Karen's reign was not. Then it was my turn. I stood up and the room fell silent again. I didn't need to shout or point fingers. All the work had been done. My name is Mark Caldwell, I said, my voice carrying easily in the quiet room. Karen has referred to me as the problematic resident. For anyone who wants to understand the facts of this minor legal matter, my lawyer, Ms. Jessica Martinez, has prepared a summary taken directly from the official court record, including sworn testimony and subpoenaed documents. There is a stack of them on the table by the door. I encourage you to read it for yourself. I pointed to the table where my wife Sarah was standing next to a large stack of our one-page flyers. A wave of people surged toward the back of the room. The sight of dozens of her neighbors eagerly grabbing and reading the documented proof of her lies and abuse was the final blow. Karen stood at the front, gavel in hand, watching her empire dissolve in real time. Her face was a mask of pure, impotent rage. She tried to shout over the noise, but no one was listening anymore. They were reading about the encroachment, the expert reports, the wasted money, and the damning email. The truth, printed in black and white, was more powerful than her gavel ever was. Finally, someone called for the vote for board president. The process was swift. Paper ballots were distributed and collected. As the votes were counted, Karen stood frozen, her face ashen. The result was announced, with 112 votes for Mr. Henderson and 3 votes for Ms. Peterson. The room exploded in applause. It wasn't just cheering, it was a collective sigh of relief, a celebration of liberation. Karen, the tyrant of Northwood Estates, had been utterly and publicly humiliated, voted out of the office she cherished by the very people she had terrorized. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the clubhouse without a word, the sound of her community's celebration chasing her into the night. The morning after the annual meeting was like the dawn after a long storm. The air felt cleaner, lighter. Mr. Henderson, true to his word, called an emergency session of the new HOA board that very evening. The 2 new members, elected alongside him, were the Garcia's father and another resident who had been unfairly fined by Karen. The old guard was gone. Their first order of business, as recorded in the official minutes, was a unanimous vote to formally withdraw the Northwood Estates Homeowners Association as a plaintiff from the lawsuit against me. The motion passed in seconds. Their second order of business was to terminate the contract with the HOA's lawyer, effective immediately, citing his failure to advise the board of the frivolous nature of the case and the misuse of funds. The third motion was the one that sealed Karen's fate. After a brief presentation by Jessica Martinez, whom the new board had invited to attend, they voted unanimously to join my countersuit. The HOA was now officially suing its former president, Karen Peterson, to recoup every single dollar she had wasted on her personal legal crusade. The hunter had officially and legally become the hunted. A certified letter was sent to Karen's lawyer informing him of the board's decision. The effect was immediate. Karen was now completely isolated, facing a 2-front legal battle against me and the very organization she once controlled. Her legal fees, which had been comfortably paid by her neighbors' dues, were now her sole responsibility. Her own lawyer, facing the grim prospect of defending a client who had lied under oath and was now being sued by his other client, the HOA, saw the writing on the wall. He called Jessica the next day and practically begged to discuss a settlement. Jessica, in her infinite wisdom, let them sweat for a week before agreeing to a meeting. The negotiation was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. Jessica laid out our terms, and they were non-negotiable. Karen would pay for everything. First, she was to write a check directly to Jessica's firm for the full amount of my legal fees, down to the last penny. Second, she was to pay the full cost of Dr. Finch's recommended remedial care for my oak tree, a sum that now included follow-up visits and soil treatments. Third, she was to pay for the professional removal of the encroaching section of her driveway. The contract stipulated that the work would be done by a company of my choosing, at a time of my choosing, and that I would personally supervise the work to ensure it was done to my satisfaction. Fourth, she had to write a check to the Northwood Estates HOA, reimbursing them for the $15,782 she had squandered on her vendetta. Finally, the part that Jessica knew would sting the most. She had to draft a formal letter of apology to me and to the community. The letter's text was to be approved by me and Mr. Henderson, and it was to be posted on the main community bulletin board in the clubhouse for no less than 30 days. Her lawyer argued weakly on a few points, but Jessica simply pointed to the videotape of the deposition and the mountain of evidence. The choice was simple: sign the settlement or face a public trial, certain bankruptcy, and potential charges for perjury. Karen signed. The following week was a series of deeply satisfying moments. The certified check for my legal fees arrived via courier. A second check, made out to Dr. Finch's company, followed. The signed apology letter, humiliating in its forced contrition, was delivered to Mr. Henderson. The circle of justice was closing, methodically and completely. There was no dramatic courtroom confession, just the quiet, relentless grinding of the legal machine she had so arrogantly set in motion against me. Every signature on every check, every clause in the settlement agreement was a testament to her downfall, a direct consequence of her own hubris. The final piece of the settlement was the driveway itself, the concrete symbol of her arrogance, and I had a special plan for that. The final act of the saga was scheduled for a bright, clear Saturday morning. At precisely 8 a.m., a large, rugged-looking truck from Precision Concrete Cutting Inc. rumbled down our quiet street and parked in front of my house. I was in my front yard, a fresh mug of coffee in hand, enjoying the morning air. Across the street, Karen's house was silent. All the blinds were drawn, a clear signal that she wanted no part in witnessing her public defeat. The crew, led by a burly man named Gus, was professional and efficient. I showed him the bright pink surveyor's flags that still stood defiantly in Karen's driveway, marking the legal property line. "Right on that line," I said. "A clean cut, all the way from the grass to the curb." Gus grinned. "You got it, boss." They rolled out a massive diesel-powered wet saw, a formidable machine that looked like it could cut through a bank vault. The sound when they fired it up was a deafening roar, a roar of finality, of consequence. For the next hour, the saw screamed as it carved a perfect, precise line through the reinforced concrete. Water sprayed from the blade, catching the morning sun in a fine mist as it sliced through the monument to Karen's entitlement. It was the loudest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard in that neighborhood. Once the cut was complete, the crew used pry bars and a small jackhammer to break up the offending 28-inch slab. They worked carefully, ensuring they didn't damage the main part of her driveway that remained on her property. They loaded the broken chunks of concrete, the physical embodiment of her trespass, into a wheelbarrow and hauled them away to their truck. When they were done, all that remained was a raw, earthy scar on the ground, a clear demarcation of where her property ended and mine began. The exposed soil was compacted and bruised, and the scarred roots of my grandfather's oak were visible, a testament to the abuse they had endured. The crew cleaned up meticulously, leaving the area neater than they had found it. I signed the invoice, which would be sent directly to Karen's lawyer for payment, and shook Gus's hand. As they drove away, a profound sense of peace settled over me. It was finally, truly over. A few days later, Dr. Finch and his team arrived to begin the tree's rehabilitation. They were like battlefield medics tending to a wounded soldier. They used the air spade again to gently decompact the suffocated soil aerating it to allow oxygen and water to penetrate. They applied a special blend of mycorrhizal fungi and slow-release nutrients to encourage new root growth. They carefully pruned the damaged root ends to prevent disease and promote healing. It was a slow, therapeutic process, a reversal of the damage Karen's recklessness had caused. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Sarah and I hosted a small barbecue in our backyard. Our guests were Mr. Henderson, the Garcias, and a few other members of the Community Alliance. Jessica Martinez came as well, a triumphant smile on her face. We stood near the base of the old oak tree, the scent of grilled food mixing with the smell of fresh earth. The scar where Karen's driveway had been was now covered in fresh topsoil and sprinkled with grass seed. It was a wound, yes, but it was already beginning to heal. Mr. Henderson, holding a bottle of beer, raised it in a toast. To good neighbors, he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth, and to strong roots. We all clinked our bottles together. I looked up through the vast, sprawling branches of the oak. It had stood on this patch of land for over 100 years, a silent witness to generations of my family. It had survived droughts, storms, and the changing of the world around it. And now it had survived Karen. The victory wasn't about the money or even the principle of the property line. It was about protecting a legacy. It was about a community finding its voice and refusing to be bullied. It was about the quiet, unshakable power of truth and persistence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays filtering through the leaves, I felt a deep, abiding satisfaction. The tree was safe, my home was secure, and the neighborhood, once fractured by fear and intimidation, was beginning to feel like a community again. Justice, like the roots of the old oak, ran deep and, in the end, had held firm.